My name is Mary Toscano. I'm a certified nutrition educator and author of the book, Sweet Fire, Sugar, Diabetes, and Your Health. My philosophy is to educate as opposed to telling you what to do. And this is the philosophy I use when raising my daughter. This is Tianna. Tianna actually burst into tears the day I announced I was going to nutrition school. She grabbed her salad dressing, of all things, clutched it against her chest, and started sobbing because she was sure that once I went to nutrition school, it was going to be the end of her favorite foods. But I told her she could eat anything she wanted as long as she had a clear understanding of what it was doing to her body and how it was making her feel and behave. So that means those times when she was bouncing off the walls from eating too much sugar and then crashed on that couch 2 hours later, she'd have to explain what was going on. So she'd say something like, I shouldn't have eaten that cake. My pancreas over-secreted insulin. Now my blood sugar's too low, and that's why I'm irritable, Mom. I'd be like, that's right, sweetie. It was more important to me that she understood what was going on than me telling her what to do. Philosophy works. She's 25 now. She eats better than I do and is much more disciplined about it. So I believe in knowledge because it's knowledge that's going to get us out of this crisis. So carbohydrates are basically broken up into two groups, simple and complex. Now here's the big aha. This is the aha that literally changed my life forever. It doesn't matter whether a carbohydrate is simple or complex. All carbohydrates, simple or complex, are just chains of sugar units. The simple are the short chains, 1 or 2 units long, and the complex are the longer chains, 3 or more units long. But they're all just chains of sugar. An example of a single unit of sugar is glucose and fructose. And if you take those two and put them together, you get sucrose. And sucrose is table sugar. An example of a complex carbohydrate is starch. And all starch is a chain of glucose molecules that can be many thousands of units long. The simple carbohydrates are referred to as sugars, and this is where it gets misleading, because the complex are sugars too. It's just a longer chain. So all carbohydrates are just chains of sugar units. It's just the shorter the chain, the sweeter the taste. And that's why foods that contain a lot of these simple sugars, like honey and syrup, taste sweet. And foods that contain a lot of the complex carbohydrates, like vegetables and legumes, don't taste sweet. But it doesn't matter whether the carbohydrate started off as simple, complex, short, or long. Ultimately, when it gets digested and processed by the body, it enters the bloodstream as a simple sugar, glucose. Glucose is good. Glucose is our body's blood sugar. We need glucose to live. Our brain and our nervous system run on glucose. Without glucose, we'd be dead. It's that simple. And glucose is glucose is glucose. Glucose is the same molecule, whether it comes from a vegetable like broccoli or from candy. One's going to come from complex carbohydrates and break down into glucose. The other is going to come from simple carbohydrates, the shorter chains, and break down into glucose. So, if we need glucose to live, and we can get it from either candy or broccoli, why not just eat candy all the time? Yeah. Well, there's two enormous differences between getting your glucose from broccoli versus candy. And the first has to do with how fast that glucose enters the bloodstream. Foods that contain a lot of complex carbohydrates, like broccoli and other vegetables, also come packaged with fiber, fat, and protein. And all three of those nutrients will slow down how fast that glucose enters the bloodstream. So when you eat the broccoli, the glucose comes in nice and slow. Candy comes with nothing to slow it down. So the sugar just gets dumped and enters the bloodstream immediately. So that's the first difference. Broccoli slow, candy fast. The second has to do with nutrient stores. And in order to understand that, let's first take a step back and talk about the difference between whole versus processed foods. So a whole food is food from nature, like this apple. The way that it looked like when it came from the ground, you know, full of life and energy and rich in nutrients that we are still discovering. Scientists are still discovering nutrients that are present in whole foods. In fact, my very favorite nutrition author, Michael Pollan, says our current knowledge of nutrition science is comparable to our knowledge of surgery in the year 1650. In other words, we have a long way to go before we understand the perfection of nature, and until we do, this is always the best way to eat food in its whole natural, unprocessed state. A processed food, on the other hand, is where you take a whole food, you process and refine it, and you turn it into something else, like this apple into applesauce or a potato into potato chips. The processed food is not the same as the whole food anymore. A lot of the nutrients have either been taken out or destroyed during the process. In fact, the more a food is processed, the more nutrients are destroyed. And one of the best examples that shows what happens when a food is processed is the process of turning wheat berries into flour. We talk all about this in the book, but by the end of the processing, not only are most all the nutrients wiped out in the flour, but basically the only thing left from the original wheat berry is starch. And remember that starch is just a chain of glucose molecules, and that glucose is going to hit the bloodstream hard. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute, but bottom line, processing destroys nutrients, and that's the second difference. So sugar is sugar, and we need sugar to live, but where are you getting it from? Are you getting it from foods that are adding to your vital nutrient stores or taking away? Are you getting it from foods that are dumping the glucose in the body or coming in a nice, slow, even pace the way the body can handle? And moderation is key. Just because something like honey has nutrients doesn't mean you can eat as much as you want. I mean, look what happened to Winnie. So all I want you to do right now is to just become aware of how much sugar you eat. And the way that I want you to do that is to start counting the teaspoons of sugar you're currently eating. Why teaspoons? Because teaspoons are a whole lot easier to visualize than grams, which is what's on nutrition labels. How do you count the teaspoons? Let's take a look at a label. This is a label for orange juice. This is the carbohydrate section. In the carbohydrate section, it shows the total number of carbohydrates. And then it subdivides it into how much of that total is fiber and how much are the simple carbohydrates referred to as sugars. Fiber is technically a carbohydrate because it's a chain of sugar molecules, but our bodies can't break it down. So it is the only carbohydrate that doesn't put sugar in the blood. In fact, it slows down those sugars which are coming in fast. So even though we know all carbs in the total, except for the fiber, will eventually turn to sugar, we want the ones that come in fast. So we're going to focus in on that sugars number. There are 4 grams of sugar per teaspoon. So to get the number of teaspoons, you just take that number and divide it by 4. So there are 7 teaspoons of sugar in a cup of orange juice. Now that's all I want you to do. I want you to look at any label. I want you to zoom in on that sugars number, and I want you to divide it by 4 to get the teaspoons. Do this for any food unless the food is made out of flour. Now remember, flour's been so processed that the only thing left from the original wheat berry is starch. And remember that starch is just a chain of glucose molecules that comes apart as soon as it hits your tongue. So when I look at that cup of flour, I only see a cup of glucose. And that glucose hits the bloodstream hard. So let's take a look at something I used to eat every day, which is a plain bagel, which is basically flour in the water. Looking at the label, we see it's very deceiving because it shows very little sugars. Yet we know sugar is being dumped into the bloodstream from all that starch. But all that starch is hiding in the total carbohydrate number. And all that starch will hit the bloodstream faster than if you ate plain table sugar. So when looking at labels and the first ingredient is flour, use the total carbohydrate number to get the teaspoons. So in this case, 48 divided by 4 means every morning I was dumping 12 teaspoons of sugar into my blood. Now you combine that with the orange juice, that is a huge hit of sugar. So just start counting.